Andrew Meyer, the Director of Conservation at the San Diego Audubon Society. Uh, um, Andrew has been working on the Hudson River for several years on scenery preservation, connecting aquatic habitat to culvert mitigation and dam removal projects. And then, of course, he's got his favorite bird memories, and I'm going to ask you, Andrew, about it when you're done. All right, thank you for joining us, Andrew.
No problem. Thank you, Murtaza. So can you hear me? Does that work? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much. That's very, very awesome and interesting information, Dr. Kaluznaya. Thanks very much. And thanks very much to Michael and Murtaza and Elise for the opportunity to talk. So I think that, or I'm sure that what I can offer, I don't have any novel research myself the way the previous speaker did, but we have an example of a local wetland restoration project that has an important overlap with our climate crisis in a number of different ways, but certainly in terms of carbon sequestration and carbon storage. So that's what I'll focus on. The first few slides here are just a quick dive into this particular local project, which we're trying to work with the city of San Diego on, and then I'll kind of zoom out and put it in a little bit of context for carbon sequestration and the climate crisis, and tie it back into the working group, what the working group here is trying to work on. So the Rewild Mission Bay project, kind of long story short, is a wetland restoration project in the northeast corner of Mission Bay. If you'll go to the next slide, the San Diego Audubon Society is a nonprofit group that's been focusing on the birds in particular in Mission Bay for decades. We started this Rewild Mission Bay feasibility study about a decade ago and have been working towards the research and the advocacy and the understanding and the planning that would go into wetland restoration. The backdrop for it, as is important to a lot of the work that we need to do to deal with, to mitigate and adapt to the climate crisis, is that Mission Bay looks totally different than it used to. It's been changed. It feels like a long, long time for one human life, but really in the 1940s and 1950s, even into the 60s, it was pretty drastically changed, as has been a lot of our state coastline, as has been a lot of the tidal wetland and mudflat habitat throughout the world in recent decades. So this is a habitat that is very rare, even at the onset. It happens when freshwater and rivers are flowing into the ocean. We've got a lot of them in Southern California, but a lot of them are much smaller, much diminished, and much degraded, because these are beautiful places that we all like to be at as well. So that's kind of the backdrop here for this Mission Bay project. This is a map from the mid 1800s, which shows just what the place looked like for thousands and thousands of years. And Kumeyaay, Native Americans, were living alongside these banks and interacting with these habitats and these resources for a long, long time. If you go to the next map, this is what it looks like in more recent history. But the air photos here give a quick glimpse as to how much terraforming, how much change we've done like I said, in a lot of coastal lagoon and coastal estuary ecosystems in Southern California. Mission Bay is just one example, but it's a really good example to look at how since the 30s into the 40s and 50s, like I mentioned, our habitats have changed drastically. And the impact here for this kind of talk is that, we started this project because it impacted birds. We're a bunch of bird lovers for sure. We connect that bird impact to the wildlife and the habitat that supports that wildlife. But we definitely got interested in this project because of the endangered species that live there. But if you go to the next slide, the change from the habitat that Mission Bay was, which was much shallower and much more tidal, to a much deeper in-water habitat and a shoreline now that is much sandier and much rockier. So basically, we put riprap where we don't want the tide to change things, and we put a sandy shore where we want to interact with the bay, and then we made the rest of the bay much deeper. So we have lost a lot. Mission Bay Regional Park is 4,000 acres. In the northeast corner of the bay, where this map zooms into, there is still 40 acres remaining of tidal wetland marsh. It's the last memory of that habitat in Mission Bay. And it's on the left side of this map. If you know the area, it's called Kendall Frost Marsh. It's owned and managed by UCSD. So the Rewild Mission Bay project, again, wrapping up this kind of wetland restoration hoped for project here. This project, the Rewild Mission Bay project, looks to expand and restore that habitat where there's a little kernel of that habitat remaining in Mission Bay. We hope to restore 220 acres or so of mudflat, of tidal wetland habitat, and give that yellow and red habitat a place for those habitats to migrate into as sea levels rise. So that's the background. That's the kind of local example of a wetland restoration project, a tidal wetland restoration project. If you go to the next slide, the reasons we talk about this, we certainly started because there's endangered species that live here, endangered birds, but everybody, a lot of the research throughout the world and in Southern California have talked about what improvement we would get for water quality in the rest of the bay if the water flowed through a tidal wetland. We would get a lot of resilience to sea level rise. This is a map here, small map about what sea level rise 1 to 2 meters will do to Mission Bay, for example, and it's a problem that we'll have all over the place, and it's a problem that we need to start planning for now, which this working group is obviously addressing head on. But we know that sea level rise is something that we need to be planning for, and that riprap and solid walls are not resilient infrastructure, especially compared to a tidal wetland, which is built to flood and ready to flood and doesn't cost anything if it's underwater. But it's also an important example of opportunity to improve equitable access. I mentioned that Kumeyaay folks were living alongside the banks of Mission Bay since time immemorial. This is an opportunity. A wetland restoration project is a great example of ways that we can get people back into a larger and expanded and more resilient marsh so that we can reconnect some of those cultural practices and reconnect some of those communities to a space that's culturally significant to everybody, but especially for Kumeyaay Native Americans. Next slide. Then in recent years, we have realized that tidal wetland habitats are amazingly efficient at sequestering carbon. So this is a quick slide looking at what emissions, what the carbon sequestration, the burial rate of carbon in habitats compared habitats. On the left, it's forest habitats, and I'm from the East Coast. Forests are the obvious carbon sequestration habitat, says me. But since I got here and started working on this Rewild Mission Bay project, it turns out that salt marshes, which is what we're talking about in Mission Bay, and other kinds of tidal habitat like seagrasses and mangroves, tidal and subtidal habitats are amazing at burying carbon away and locking it away for hundreds and hundreds of years. And as Dr. Gagliazzana mentioned, we're talking about on the order of decades, or, we have less than decades to deal with this issue. So locking away a substantial amount of carbon in these natural habitats, even if we're only talking hundreds of years and not forever, will definitely help put us on the path of short-term mitigation that we need to be moving towards. So salt marsh there is in the middle. And so it's a logarithmic scale on the left. So they're very efficient at locking away the sediment and the dead plants and animals and the carbon that is associated with those materials in the marsh as the marsh rises year by year with inputs to it from plants and animals and from sediment coming down from freshwater streams and coming in from the tide. Next slide, please. So the way that we have been interacting with this and the way that I have definitely been diving into this issue a little bit, I'm not a wetland scientist at all, but we have been supporting the city of San Diego in their new climate action plan. They have a plan from about 6 years ago, and they just recently passed their update to that, a 5-year plan in August of 2022. And in that plan, their climate action plan, strategy 5 deals with natural habitats. And so if you, it's quite small on the screen, but this teal color is what strategy 5 is looking at adding to this deficit that the city of San Diego needs to reach for their climate action plan. The other pieces here that are missing are the other 5 strategies, the other 4 strategies, and then strategy 6 is what needs to happen below this line. So there's a lot of other activities and other actions that the city needs to take, which make up the bulk of this deficit, which we need to reach. But strategy 5, including wetland restoration, is on this plan, and it's a requirement for the acreage now of tidal wetland restoration that the city needs to meet in order to eliminate and deal with this slice of the problem that we have. And up there at the top are the 2030 and 2035 targets. So the city of San Diego committed to 700 acres of wetland restoration by 2035, tidal wetland restoration, which we think is great. We would love to work with them on doing some of that right here in Mission Bay. But what's important about this as well, it's a thin line, but it also has all of those other benefits that we were talking about earlier, the ones that got us jazzed about this at the very beginning. So there's a lot of co-benefits to it, but it also is the only strategy in the city's plan, at least, that is talking about going negative. So this is not about, and we need to deal with this certainly, but this is not about lowering the emissions that we have from our other necessary pieces of our development and our lives and our communities here in San Diego. It's about sequestering some of that carbon that will have to be emitted from many of the other pieces of our lives here. We need some habitats, we need some spaces that will go negative and sequester those carbons, not just lower the amount that we're emitting, but also take some of those emissions away and lock them away. So this is what's exciting and significant about this habitat and these kinds of habitats in particular. Next slide. Yeah, and so a lot of the research that went into this and the quantification was done by EPIC, and I know they are here and involved in this working group as well. So this research that went into the references and whatnot, and the quantification here was heavily involved, heavily created by EPIC, which is fantastic. One more slide. And finally, some tables and charts. So if you do, these are two. The top one is the one from the EPIC report, which was just on the other slide. And the bottom one is preliminary data from research that's going on in Kendall Frost Marsh in Mission Bay, as well as some other places. So this is preliminary research. It's not been published yet, but suffice it to say that just like Dr. Marina was saying earlier, there's a lot of research that needs to happen, not only about tidal wetland habitats, but all of our other habitats as well. They emit some methane, they emit some carbon dioxide, certainly, but they also sequester a lot. At the moment, tidal wetland habitat was the only habitat that made it into the city's climate action plan, because there was enough research there to quantify what it would do per acre. But this information here, if you go one more slide, just lots and one more slide, lots of information here that's coming out as people are researching and trying to understand how the habitats change over time, how they change in relationship to their management history, and how they change in terms of depth and how much fresh water is going into them. These two comparisons here in these red boxes are just to highlight that in the top one, which is the information that was available for the city plan, of just over 1 megaton of carbon per acre is what's average for tidal wetland restoration. But in the bottom box here, at the top of that one, Mission Bay, a few of the samples that have been looked at so far, and a lot more research has to go into this, is seeing perhaps 3-4 times more carbon being sequestered per acre than that average of the research I think EPIC cited here was from San Francisco Bay. So not to say that we're guaranteeing any amount of number that we'll be able to reach, but there is some heterogeneity in how much carbon is sequestered per site, and we need more research in order to figure out the management and the restoration goals that can improve the amount of sequestration that happens and get 8 megagrams of carbon per hectare as best we can, as long as we're also delivering on that access, that water quality restoration, the resilience, and the bird habitat. If you ask us, we would say bird habitat should be in there for sure. But if you go one more slide, I think this is it for me. I just wanted to emphasize that there's research going on. And if you click one more slide too, that's the end. There we go. So I just wanted to emphasize that the tidal wetland habitat is just the example habitat that we have some research on so far, enough to quantify and say, yes, this kind of habitat helps us go negative, helps sequester more carbon than it releases, and can help sequester some of the carbon that we will be emitting to the atmosphere for a long, long time. And it's also a positive project. All the rest of the strategies in the city's plan, for example, are positive in that there's jobs created, there's good results for carbon capture and carbon sequestration. But this particular project is a project that brings people together, it restores habitat, and it provides all these other co-benefits in addition to carbon sequestration. So we think it's critical for that. And so do a lot of other players in this. There's a lot of grant funding out there to do this kind of coastal resilience, coastal habitat restoration, and improved access opportunities. So we would love to work with anybody. And I know there are other projects going on just like this one that are farther along and more nascent in the county of San Diego, certainly. So we hope that it's an example project that will get repeated in lots of places. So I think that's it for me, Mirza. Oh yeah, references. So this will be shared digitally for anybody who wants to jump into some of the details there.
Thank you, Andrew. Really appreciate this holistic, comprehensive perspective that brings everybody together, which is kind of the theme of this decarbonization framework: community, different environmentalists, different kind of stakeholders than just about sequestration on rewild projects. So the information and your experience in that rewild, do you have any suggestions for action on something similar using natural climate solutions?
Yeah, so I see that Mary from Wild Coast just put information here, and I was ready to answer this, Mirza, just by saying that I emphasized that we need more research, but that research, we have enough to know a little bit about how these kinds of habitats generally sequester carbon and how they generally function. But Wild Coast in particular is leading more research in a couple of other tidal wetland ecosystems, and they've started restoring 40 acres or so in Los Penasquitos, I think it is, Mary. So there's a couple of dimensions here about projects that are moving along and how big those projects are. The county is in rough shape in that most of these opportunities for wetland restoration are in city land, so cities all along the coast. And I know that's a big barrier to the county getting involved. I've talked to many of the supervisors and many of the staff, and it's an easy project from the county's perspective to say, yes, totally, because they're not the ones who will hear about the other land uses that folks want to happen here or the changes in land use that will happen here. But it would be great for the county, and I think this is kind of a policy question. I'm sure it's complicated, but we want the county to get the carbon credits, whether it's money directly or whether it's goes into their climate action plan and shows up as some of that loss, that sequestration, the negative emissions that happen from this kind of restoration. We want the county to get some of that if they foster these kinds of projects. So whether the local cities who have more land use control over these kinds of habitats, whether they would allow sharing of those benefits if funding came in or if policies came in that promoted them, that would be a great way for the county to help support these projects up and down the coast of San Diego, even though they don't have the local municipal control over the property. But a lot of funding and a lot of policy and a lot of momentum can happen from a county perspective, especially if they would then get some of that sequestration and emissions benefit into their plan. If they help bring those projects around. So that would be fantastic, and it would help put some of these cities on the path towards more of these kinds of projects, knowing that the county was there supporting these kinds of projects with funding and again with momentum and outreach for these kinds of projects. So that nature-based solutions, tidal wetland restoration is a perfect example of a nature-based solution. There are lots of other ones which we didn't go into here. But those ones, a lot of those ones, especially the coastal ones, will have to happen on municipally controlled and city controlled properties. So the county's role for policy, momentum, funding, those kinds of things will be important for those.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And it's also the question about blue carbon and how it's studied and underutilized as sequestration measure as well as carbon capture. We've had this discussion for a very long time, right from the time we started this project, because oftentimes that is kind of the understudied issue. When I went to several city councils, like such as Imperial Beach, we were specifically, there were questions about how can we partner on blue carbon issues. When there's jurisdictional agencies such as the port, they have several wetlands under port jurisdictions. I'm not sure about San Elijo Lagoon, whether that falls within the county's jurisdiction. Nonetheless, the county is one of the entities in this effort on decarbonization, and that is a question that can be addressed by other agencies too. So this is not just about the county implementing it. So
Definitely.
with that, yes, thank you. So I want to like appreciate this topic, and I want to ask you if there's case studies outside our region that you could kind of like point us to about how this kind of a multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional collaboration could help in this effort.
Yeah. Yeah, great setup and great question. So I guess a couple of quick things. Wild Coast organizes a group of folks that are now from far around the world in their previous meeting or in their recent meetings, but it was focused on Southern California at the beginning. There's a blue carbon kind of working group that they organize a quarterly or several times a year just Zoom meeting that to share some of those local projects. So I can help you get in touch with Wild Coast and get into those meetings or anybody if they're interested. But thank you to Wild Coast for organizing that group. One of the great examples of a state, of a kind of state level project is just north of us in Oregon. They have put blue carbon into their natural and working lands policy. So that one is an example of a statewide effort that is starting to and has quantified and gone through all of the rough and tedious rigmarole it's going to take in order to say this kind of tidal wetland and this kind of chaparral habitat and this kind of freshwater wetland is all translates into this much carbon sequestration and this much storage over the course of its life. For what information they have available, they have put especially the blue carbon and the coastal component to it into their statewide plan. So that's a good example of a state that is dealing with this along their entire coastline and that plan is available. And I know that some of those folks are the folks that have been involved in the Wild Coasts, shared at the Wild Coast meetings about blue carbon. So there's a couple of examples. I know it's been in the newspaper too, that in Virginia, the groups like the Nature Conservancy are starting to get and quantify and get the carbon credits for wetland restoration. So they also, the Nature Conservancy, obviously that big organization, has an example project they've been working on for several years in order to get to the point where they can say, we're going to restore X amount of acres and it's going to be worth this much. But one thing I would also add to this is that for our project, for Rewild Mission Bay, there are lots of grants out there that want to get at this kind of thing, habitat restoration, improved access, coastal resilience, and they're not available for a project that wants to be a carbon credit kind of project. So there's two different kind of, I know the port is very involved in this as well. There are options for carbon credit and banking where folks need options, need to support and need to buy into a project that would be a tidal wetland restoration project. But there's also lots of support from state agencies like the Coastal Conservancy and the Ocean Protection Council and the EPA that want to fund projects that are restoration projects, and you're not you can't get those kinds of projects if you then will turn around and sell those credits for in a carbon banking kind of situation. So whichever way you want to go is fine, but there is lots of funding available for projects that don't need that monetary value from a carbon banking perspective. So that's an option as well.
Thank you. And one final question, Andrew, and this one has got to do with regional collaboration. We just saw a considerable amount of regional collaboration between, like, say, the city and the county on the river, the Central River system. And I kind of want to highlight there both in terms of financial commitment, but also acquisition and kind of taking care of the land itself, which would hopefully change the land use pattern around the river itself. With that, the underlying question here is, I mean, if the river can be blue carbon, couldn't we make a case that it is decarbonization? Could we make a case with this? And in terms of regional collaboration, could this be a model for similar kind of decarbonization initiatives?
Yeah, I think that would be fantastic, Murtaza. The caveat being we need more research. I'm not definitely up on all of the research, but I know that there's an important difference between freshwater wetlands and tidal wetlands in terms of the amount of methane that they release. So a tidal wetland was on that first slide as being very, very efficient because they don't emit very much, but they do a great job of locking it away. And that's a distinction between that kind of habitat and a freshwater wetland. But all of the kinds of projects that a group like San Diego Audubon Society is focused on, which is all about wildlife and supporting and protecting places that humans can get into and are valuable to wildlife. All of those places have a carbon storage value to them right now and have a carbon sequestration value per year as they grow and lock away some of that carbon. So right along the San Diego River, riparian habitats do the same and have a value. As far as I know, we just don't know that, and we don't know how heterogeneous it is yet. But with more research, Scripps and UCSD are the ones partnering on the work in Kendall Frost Marsh. Wild Coast is also super involved in that. The more we can get some local examples, the more we can say, hey, these kinds of habitats have value. Here's what that value is. And now we can put it right into our quantification method. So we need that, definitely.
Thank you, Andrew. So we may be already implementing the regional decarbonization framework. We may just not be calling that.
Yeah, definitely.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. And I promised to ask you, what is your favorite bird memory?
Oh, yeah. I put that on my, Murtaza asked me for a bio, and I always put in there some weird places that are hard for folks to pronounce just to trip them up as they're introducing me. No,
I
but
turn back on you, brother.
Okay, currently my favorite bird memory is probably oyster catchers. I used to work on Anacapa Island as part of Channel Islands National Park. So that's where I first met my first oyster catchers, and they're still one of my favorites. So there you go. Thanks, Murtaza.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. And that concludes it too. We only had 2 presentations today, but we did them pretty in depth. So there was a lot of interest in the first